So my name's Emmy Wang. I'm part of the PACE project team. I'm in an organization called the Greenlining Institute. And so just to kind of situate us a little bit here, as background, Greenlining, we are a racial and economic justice policy organization. I'm based here out of Oakland, but we do statewide facing work. So yeah, interacting with some of those big systems that I think a lot of us were talking about in the breakout groups. And our mission is to bring economic opportunities to low-income communities of color through research, policy, advocacy, and leadership development. So in talking about why we have to lead with racial equity, I'm going to tell three stories. First, I'm going to tell the story of the past and recount just like a really small snapshot of racist policies in America, of which there are very many. Then I'm going to tell the story of today and how that past manifests in the environmental injustices that we see today. And then finally, I'm going to tell the story of tomorrow and how we have to work together to create the society you want to see that's just, that's healthy, where all people thrive. So starting with the past, sorry, I'm just going to mute. Okay, cool. Okay, so just to root us in like one very specific inequitable policy among many. So in the 1930s, in the middle of the Great Depression, many families were struggling to make ends meet and were defaulting on their mortgages. In response, federal housing agencies began issuing government-backed mortgages to help post-war families build. But I think, as we all know, not all families received help. So to figure out how to distribute mortgages, government worked with bankers and realtors to create maps to identify which neighborhoods to invest in based on credit risk. So here on the kind of top left, you can see an example of Oakland. They created a grading system based on several factors like quality of housing, but the primary indicator of risk was race. The neighborhoods were graded based on a color code that you can see on the map. So green neighborhoods were the best, blue meant still desirable, yellow meant definitely declining, and then red meant hazardous. So areas that were redlined were seen as credit risks because of the presence of primarily Black folks and then also other folks of color. So this is where the term redlining comes from. And the image on the bottom of the slide is a 1937 audit from surveyors for the city of Oakland. And you can see language that was common, like infiltration of Negroes and Orientals listed as a detrimental influence in neighborhood. The government also had a manual that said incompatible racial groups were not permitted to live in the same communities. So between 1932 and 1962, that's 30 years, the federal government backed $120 billion of loans, of which more than 98% went to white folks. So at a time when white Americans were building wealth to fund their children's education, start businesses, buy homes, Black, Indigenous, and people of color were shut out entirely from those opportunities. So this lack of investment, alongside with many, many other racist policies that we've talked about today, starting with land theft, genocide, and enslavement, is part of what has led to the extreme wealth inequality that we see here today along race lines. Okay, so kind of skipping a couple decades to today. This slide has three maps. This is again all of Oakland, and the first is the 1937 redlining map. The middle is a 2018 Callan virus green map, and then the map on the right is communities with the most number of COVID cases here. And what you'll see immediately is that the communities of color that were impacted by redlining continue to be the most impacted by COVID and poverty and pollution today. So Latinx communities we know are seeing some of the highest number of COVID cases. Black communities are experiencing the highest mortality rates. And we know that both COVID is devastating many Native communities, and that also the data that we have available at a kind of a federal level on Native communities in COVID is still in many cases really incomplete. And then you'll see in the middle map, right, that Callan virus green map, the red and orange communities that suffer the most today from poverty and pollution are the very same communities that were redlined over 80 years ago. In California, a 2018 state agency analysis shows that 89% of people in the poorest, most polluted communities in California are people of color. And it's important to note that redlining was just obviously one government policy that created inequities along race lines. It's far from the only one. So continuing the story, right? Race is the biggest predictor of living near a polluting facility in California and also across the country. Environmental racism is not new. It is built on a foundation of policy decisions designed with race as a principal factor, implemented by federal, state, and local governments, reinforced and ratified by law enforcement and the courts, and then exploited by private entities to reap economic benefits at the expense of vulnerable communities. And then when you add climate change to the existing injustices that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are experiencing, it acts as a threat multiplier to those injustices. And it leads to a climate gap where poor folks and communities of color are hit first and worst by climate disasters like floods and wildfires. So where does that leave us? Yeah, just taking a moment to like shake that off. Like we know that that is the systems in which we live, and also it's heavy, right? It's heavy, it's a lot. So just taking a moment and then shifting kind of into today, right? So how, on that backdrop, how do we move forward? For us, this means transforming the behaviors, institutions, and systems that harm Indigenous communities, Black communities, and people of color. And it means centering community ownership of the solutions, right? Which is all the work that you all are doing locally in community in collaboration with your local ecosystems. So equity means increasing access to power, redistributing and providing additional resources, and then eliminating barriers to opportunity. So with that, kind of that as a backdrop, from here I want to share a framework and a tool that we developed that we hope is helpful for you as you forward your local visions. We developed this framework because equity has become a really popular buzzword as of late. And as it becomes mainstream, yeah, there's a real risk that equity is turning into an empty promise if there's no strategy on how to achieve that promise. So this framework, we use this all the time as a guide for our internal and external work. Even as a racial justice organization, it's really helpful to have the rigor of this structure to inform our work and our projects. And yeah, Michelle, it's not simple, but it's even worse when, yeah, it's just a word, right? Equity, and then no one knows what to do with that, right? The other kind of value or application I think we see of this framework is we know, and we've been talking about today, that there's such a gap between community and then like policy, institutional, governmental structures, right? What we know is community, we're struggling under the weight of these systemic inequalities, and we just want clean air, we want livable neighborhoods, we want quality of life. What we want is a more equitable future. But I'm sure some of you have had this experience before. When you go to your local or regional government, or you go to someone in your community who holds institutional power, when you go to policymakers and you say like, hey, this program isn't working, it's not equitable, it's leading to disparities. Oftentimes institutional power like doesn't know how to take that, right? They don't know what to do with that. Your local policymakers, in many cases, they want really specific, discrete, and tangible ways to design and implement policy. So they might speak the broad language of equity, but they absolutely do not know what it might look like, how to get there, any of that. So the framework, I think, is one way we've found to evaluate systems of power and communicate the ways in which they are failing, essentially. So this is the framework. And yeah, if there's one thing that you walk away with today, I hope it's these 4 steps. So for any project, plan, or policy, we say that equity has to be embedded in the goals, vision, and values, in the process, in the implementation, and in the analysis. So this is kind of like the framework writ large. And again, mentioning quickly, we have reports on this. We have where the slides will be made available to you. So please don't frantically type notes up if you don't want to. Okay, so let's unpack these 4 categories. So for us, for goals, we mean how is equity described in the context of the overall goal of the project? Is equity core, which it should be, or is it missing? For process, how does the policy or project propose to deliver outcomes with equity as a focus? How are decisions made or influenced by communities with less political power or voice? For implementation, how does implementation lead to equity outcomes? What are those explicit equity outcomes, and how are they described? And then finally, for analysis, it's, how are we measuring equity progress, right? Like, how do we know when we are midway or done with a project that we achieved our goals? So our theory is that equity has to show up in all 4 categories to create the strongest outcomes for our communities, and that we have to be really explicit about it. Because again, equity is not just a commitment, it's a practice. And what we see, what the kind of the status quo is, when programs or investments or policies are developed and implemented without an intentional consideration of equity, that's how you get to the world that we live in today, right? Racial inequities are either forgotten, they're reinforced, or they're exacerbated. So from here, I'm going to go into each step right now and then share some examples. So here for goals, we've been talking about this a little bit, which is that equity can't just be a talking point, right? Programs, projects, your own, or, if you're looking at a governmental policy, programs should explicitly state a commitment to equity and specifically identify the vulnerable populations that that program is prioritized for. If an effort is serious about creating equitable outcomes, then it has to make that explicit in the goals. So here on the chart, what you can see is we developed just basically some guiding questions to think through as you are building and or evaluating a project or program. So some of those questions for us include, first of all, what's the shared definition of equity that we're using? I think in any program or project that we've been a part of, everyone has a really different starting point, right? So being clear on your shared definition. What specific vulnerable communities are the focus of the project? Are project benefits accessible to underserved communities? And then importantly, what collective values undergird your collective work together? So the more that these questions are thought about at the beginning of a project, the more likely it is that processes and implementation strategy will be developed that then achieve those equity goals. So here we have an example that we like to point to, which is a big, countywide project. It's the LA County Sustainability Plan. And the reason why we use this is because equity in this plan isn't just one goal, but it's threaded into almost all of the 12 goals. So you can see we pulled out some examples here. Goal number 1, right, talks about healthy and resilient communities and specifically mentions low-income and communities of color. Goal 3 talks about the importance of equitable land development and development without displacement. And then goal 11 talks about the need for inclusive and accountable governance. So the kind of procedural equity and the how dimensions of that. Okay, so for the second step here is around process, which is that for us, processes need to be led by impacted community members. So we call this procedural equity, which is how we work together and who makes the decisions. And that procedural equity is just as important as what is commonly known as distributed equity, right, which is the outcomes of a project. So as you all have probably experienced, the more that you get into larger programs or projects, the more likely it is that those projects get further and further away from community. So it's important to hold institutional power to task about who gets to make the decisions, who speaks, who decides, who holds structural power. So again, guiding questions. The first is a big one. How is power shared? How is the project governed by community members, or how is it governed collaboratively? For community engagement, we ask how the project will be designed to collaborate and work with and be led by vulnerable populations, and how it might be accessible to folks who don't speak English or have access to technology or have disabilities, for example. And then we ask if the project will create direct or indirect burdens on already vulnerable populations. And then maybe last year I'll mention, in terms of, again, the how, right? We ask if the project will, through the process of working together, will we be able to increase the capacity and leadership of community members? Are we building skills, capacity and leadership through the work of working together? So here, I'll just shout out Movement Strategy Center. They developed this amazing tool called the Spectrum of Community Engagement to Ownership. And we use it all the time, and MSc is actually going to dive deeper into this during our next PACE session. So lots to look forward to. But briefly, as a teaser, I think what the spectrum does, it helps you to get really clear about where you are on a community engagement, right? Often communities are only informed about a project, right, the left side of that spectrum, rather than seen as collaborators or leaders. And this bare minimum, this happens when people don't care about community engagement, right? So we want to be moving towards creation and co-creation, where historically marginalized communities lead and have ownership over the planning process and its outcomes. And then another application we found this really helpful. We found this in times when we are partnering with institutional power, we actually find it really helpful to get clear on where they're at. Like if they can honestly do an honest self-reflection of where they think they are on the spectrum of community engagement, it actually really helps so that they don't overpromise the kinds of power or decision-making authority they're open to giving to community. I think that a lot of equity washing happens when folks say one thing and then do another. So this is also a really helpful tool to get really clear. Okay. Okay, third step is all about, the implementation of the policy or project has to lead to equity outcomes that respond to community needs, reduce vulnerabilities, and increase community resilience. So this requires a good understanding of those community identified needs and really building off the previous two steps. And yeah, the questions here I think are pretty self-evident, but important to say, which is, right, how does the effort address community identified needs? What are the intended direct and measurable outcomes of your project? How can the benefits be targeted in progressive ways to reduce disparities? And then are you thinking about shared and multiple benefits, right? Economic benefits, health benefits, or other benefits included? So here, I wanted to highlight a project from one of our PACE leaders, Felipe, who works with Pacoima Beautiful. So Pacoima Beautiful has been leading the transformative climate communities work in the Northeast San Fernando Valley. This is a project that's investing $23 million in state funds to create comprehensive greenhouse gas reducing strategies within a 5 square mile area. So if you let me shout out Felipe and Pacoima Beautiful a little bit, Pacoima Beautiful has been organizing for healthy environmental conditions for over 20 years. And they are really the anchor for this project, right? They're clear on their equity goals in terms of centering a vision around building neighborhoods that are safe, green, and resilient to climate change. And I think in the last year or so, they've started capital construction on public transit, active transportation, rooftop solar, and greening projects. And then they're also really clear that this project is led by community, right? They are the only project which has been awarded thus far that has a nonprofit entity rather than local or regional government as the lead grantee. So that's absolutely huge, right? A nonprofit organization is anchoring a $23 million grant. So they're really pioneering a model for large community plans anchored by a community-based organization. So yeah, I mean, because, right, they've centered equity in their goals and they've centered equity in their process, then we're confident that the project is going to build in equitable results and benefits. So super excited to see this project come to life. I believe they're in year 1 of 5 of like implementation and capital construction. So just super excited to see what comes of this amazing work. Now, okay, and then lastly, the last step is analysis of the policy planet program. So projects should always be regularly evaluating their equity successes and challenges. And this is often the hardest step, I think, in that I think the field is still evolving how to measure for equity, how to measure for procedural equity, which again is around like who's making decisions and holding power. And also how to measure for collective impact as opposed to just individual inputs and outputs. So that being said, again, we offer some guiding questions here. First is around accountability. So how will you include accountability checkpoints to measure outcomes throughout the project and ensure that vulnerable populations, communities will equitably benefit and not be disproportionately harmed. Second is adaptive management. So if data is showing that you're not on track to meet your equity goals, like what are the checkpoints to ensure that you can course correct? And then the third is communication. How will you transparently communicate progress to community partners and stakeholders throughout the project? Probably the most important thing to know, though, is that the equity metrics will be dependent on the equity goals that you set out at the very beginning, right? There's no one size fits all of equity metrics. I think we often have folks like asking us, what are the metrics we should use? And it's entirely adapted. It needs to be adapted and customized to your equity goals. All right, so that's it. That's the framework. To summarize, the main takeaway is that whatever project or policy that either you're developing or that you're working with in collaboration, these 4 steps around centering equity in your goals, process, implementation, analysis, we hope can serve as a helpful roadmap to creating meaningful equity outcomes.
So Michelle and I are going to take a little bit of time just to kind of set a little bit of context for, again, like, how do we do that? When we think about colonialism, like, and we think about traditional, like, planning context and shifting that, like, what does that look like? Understanding that this concept of planning, right? That if we tap back into our ancestry, if we tap back into really honoring land, and indigeneity, right? A lot of kind of what you lifted up, Christy, is that we've been doing this, right? Like, this isn't anything new. Like, we know how to kind of honor the land and govern with each other and really do that type of planning, even if it's not contextually in this colonial way. And so how do we actually shift that? How do we actually reorient to a lot of those values and those principles? So we're going to get into a little bit of that today. I'm gonna pass, but before we go to the next slide, just want to honor the Sankofa bird in the center, and again, really just the shoulders that we're standing on, honoring that ancestry. And I love how we've been able to kind of have that as a consistent thread in holding this group together. Really important. So Michelle and I are going to attempt to go ahead and share with you all the spectrum of engagement to ownership for community-driven planning. Before that, we'll also briefly touch upon the community-driven climate resilience planning framework, just to give some context, given it's a tool in relationship to that process. So if you have any questions or things that come up along the way, please do go ahead, pop off in the chat, share it as they arise so that we can either take stock and address them later or address them along the way. And please, just to know that this is a taste of the work that we do and how we do to truly democratize planning in general, and also for climate justice in particular. Often we facilitate an hour and a half, maybe to 2 hour sessions, half day, day long, several month processes, and day long. But for this is going to be brilliant and brief, super brief. And we won't get into the level of depth necessary, but we're going to give you just enough because y'all are so dope, right? Y'all are already doing amazing work. And we want to make sure that we are taking the opportunity to learn from you and giving you all the space to, lift up and make the connections to the work that you're already doing. So with that, next slide, Michelle's going to ground us in some context.
Yeah, so we're going to try to be brilliant and brief, and we're going to give you some of the prequels. So this is kind of the prequel. This is, we've been diving in where the partner is accelerating climate equity. So what is equity? And taking a moment to sort of define what some of the differences are between equality, equity, and social justice. I find that a lot of groups start fighting because they're coming from different perspectives on this. So hopefully this helps us avoid some of that. And also help us when we know we need to speak sort of interculturally in terms of these concepts. So, and many of you have probably already heard this and trained on this, so that's fine if it's just a little overview. My favorite analogy for the differences between equality and equity and justice, and really the only metaphor that's really stuck with me, is one about shoes. So in an equality system, we'd say, we need to give everybody deserves a pair of shoes. We're going to give everybody a pair of shoes. So equality does that. Every single person gets a pair of shoes. Equity says, wait a minute, I'm a size 11. Corinne's like a size 7. So like giving us all one pair of shoes doesn't work. Plus, honestly, I already have 3 pairs of shoes, but my neighbor doesn't have any shoes. So it doesn't really make sense to give everybody one pair of shoes when some of us have too many, some of us don't have enough. So equity says that in order to balance things out, we actually might be giving people different things based on their needs. Not shocking to any of us, I don't think. social justice says, hold on a second, like, we already gave everybody a pair of shoes last year. Like, why are the shoes running out? Or even like, why is there a system where some people literally have 100 pair of shoes and some people have no shoes? So social justice starts getting at the systems and structures and histories that got us to this point that make it so that some people are in desperate need of shoes. So we're moving along the spectrum. Sometimes it does make sense to like work with our partners who are in different places, but I wanted to just give that overview of equality. Is just like everyone deserves the same thing. It's sort of like the golden rule, like treat everyone how you want to be treated. Equity says, wait a minute, some people have different cultures and might want to be treated differently, and respect to me might look different than it looks to somebody else. And social justice is really like, oh, you got the emojis in there. So that's really some of the differences between equality, equity, and social justice. And that's what we're really talking about, and trying to get to a place where we can restructure systems so we don't keep going through cycles where people are in desperate need of some basic need. Next slide. And feel free to chat in, and we'll look after, but feel free to chat in if that vibes with your experience and the ways that you understand it, and if there's any other metaphors you prefer. Yeah, I don't like that picture at the baseball field. That's why I purposely was like, this is the only metaphor that stuck with me. So we can talk about that at some point. But the baseball field one is often, it just is missing something, and its approach is weird. I don't know what the purpose is, and if everybody needs to see the baseball game, I don't know. This next slide can seem complicated, so I'm just going to give you just the basic overview. We're not going to get deeply into it. Basically, the essence is that research shows again and again that people of color care more about environmental issues, are more willing to take action, are more willing to pay money for things that are more environmentally friendly, and more willing to make voting decisions based on the environment than white voters and white consumers. But this seems to surprise us all over and over again, and it even surprises our own communities. So really what this research was getting at is that and you know what, actually, let me just say a moment, because Christy, you were talking about there's not a lot of research, and I just want to name that this and a lot of the research that I have on approaches to environmental concerns does not include Native people. But I will say that 80% of Earth's biodiversity is on the 20% of land owned or controlled by Native people. So I think that gives us a sense of Native approaches to environment. Basically, this is just saying that even within our own communities, we tend to underestimate our concern for environmental issues. So we all think, I care this much, but all the other Latinos only care this much. And same for Black and Asian communities, whereas white communities seem to be doing the opposite and saying, I only care this much, but I think all my peers care a lot more. So the narrative around environmentalism is wrong. Can we go to the next slide real quick? That just drives this point home more. This is around who is willing to take action and who is self-reporting taking action based on caring about climate. And really Latina and Black women are leading on all of these themes as well. So really the point of these is not necessarily to get into the numbers, but to say, why does the environmental movement not look like this then? And why do our policymaking spheres, climate action spheres, resilience spheres not look like the people who are actually willing to put more on the line to make these things happen? So how do we move to a movement that's not marginalizing some of the biggest champions that we could have? So yeah, that's the narrative. Corinne will take us to some of the narratives around resilience.
Yes, thank you. Next slide. So again, to Michelle's point, I just think it's really important just when we're in a room, like to be having the same conversation, right? And, you know, to a point of like really addressing, we throw around these terms all the time, equality, equity, you know, social justice, EJ, climate, right? But we all have our own different relationships to them that may be similar, but sometimes, often they're not. And like, so even with this terminology, climate resilience, right? I just want to recognize that in the context of the work and given what Michelle just shared, that, you know, resilience in the last 10 years or so, the experience has been that it's been somewhat co-opted, right? Or even before that, before people were even using it. Especially from a community standpoint. And so it hasn't necessarily meant within traditional planning context in terms of how community gets characterized as vulnerable, as marginalized, as, oh, like y'all are resilient, you know? And some folks actually reject it. They're like, no, like what we need is resistance. So I just want to name here that there are different entry points and relationships to this term, all very valid, all very true. And I think that we need to recognize and honor that for where folks are at and their experience. And then actually what we're asserting here when we reference climate resilience is like that it is actually, we're reclaiming it, right? It's a strength-based narrative. It's asset-driven. So that is what we mean, is asserting exactly that we're reclaiming it in a comprehensive way so that we can be clear about what we mean in terms of climate resilience and in the larger context, community-driven climate resilience planning. So next slide. So just to dig in a little bit deeper, I just wanted to recognize that, again, with this term resilience, and our experience, especially in the government context, is that, you know, sometimes, you know, government planning folks are like, we have to do adaptation, we have to do mitigation. Oftentimes, we may not hear much about social cohesion and equity. They might say we might want to apply it, but we're not baking here. We're not sprinkling it on, right? We're actually looking at, we want to assert, and this was something that we had collaboratively co-developed in conversation with the Kresge Foundation and Movement Generation over the last several years to really define that actually it's all of these things, right? Social cohesion making up what we call deep democracy, which is at the heart of transformational change, right? What's exciting about this definition is that it brings together the important bodies of work, right? So even when we talk about mitigation, right, what does that mean? Localized food systems, right? Therefore, they can reduce carbon emissions. Social cohesions, building that so that we can understand that which connects community members to each other and increases the strengths and social networks and the social capital. And then equity, right? Meaning that community-led, community-owned, the practice of holding equity at the center, right? And adaptation, understanding that we have to make things affordable and accessible, right? Given things like rising food costs, given, again, like the triple pandemic we're in. Next slide. So aside from the spectrum, which I know that you will you've seen, and as resources as part of PACE have been offered, you might have heard about the community-driven climate resilience planning framework, as well as the spectrum of community engagement to ownership. And you know, you heard a little bit about it from Annie when we last met. So I just wanted to kind of name that there are so many great tools within this community-driven climate resilience planning framework. And actually, like, the spectrum is very much in relationship to this framework, as well as other tools that are in it. So I encourage you all to take the time afterwards to dig in or re-dig in if you already kind of have to this framework. It was launched officially in 2017. But the earlier conversations happened in 2013, 2014, with just grassroots community leaders across the country who were really already doing this work at the kind of like community-led level. And we're like, this is what planning needs to look like. And how are we fundamentally shifting that? So that is kind of what is at the essence of this framework. And I also just want to shout out, there's some amazing highlights in there, including our very own cohort member organization, Poder. Is in there as well as some other amazing organizations. Next slide. So when we think about community-driven planning, I just want to kind of say that our intention is that community-based is community-driven, right? And that the framework is framed as community-driven climate resilience planning, but that the framework is actually more extensive and deeper and can apply in that way, right? So even though it's talking from a climate resilience lens, and even when we go to the framework, right, we'll be thinking about even in our own experience, and this is PACE, right? Even our own experience thinking of things in a climate lens. I just want to name that all of these principles and capacities are relevant for any type of community-driven planning, right? To really, again, build leadership outside of local agencies, increase collaboration and capacity, and make sure that we are taking a holistic approach to the different sectors in relationship to each other as we devise solutions. Next slide. So at the core of community-driven planning, like, this is our engine, right? And so you kind of see behind me too, like, vision, power, solutions, which is like perfect for the moment we're in. So as you get deeper into the framework, one of the things that in co-developing this framework, a lot of the leaders found was that when we plan, when we do anything, it has to start with asserting a community vision. putting forward what that is that flows from community priorities, solutions development, the capacity to assess like what are the community's vulnerabilities and assets, and then what are then the appropriate solutions in terms of building on communities' vast, unique experience. And then power building, right? That there needs to be the community capacity of voice and power to actually get those climate solutions both resourced and implemented. And so next slide. So in understanding that, and there's a whole web also in the framework, right? But at the center, that is the engine of what drives community-driven planning. That the leaders that co-developed this framework had distilled 5 principles, right? All of those principles being here, right? Whole systems thinking, right? How are we thinking about climate impact, society, energy, water, food systems in a comprehensive way, given that they're so complex and so are the challenges around them. Desired outcomes reflected in every step, right? So making sure that outcomes and principles such as equity, community-derived planning, that actually should be embedded in each step of the planning and implementation process in whatever we're doing. Planning process is learning process, right? And I think this is really an important one because sometimes we can kind of charge ahead, you know, and kind of lose sight of like how we're in relationship to each other and what we're doing. So it's important for increasing the understanding of causes and consequences, if we look at the climate frame of climate disruption and processes and actually pathways to address it. So we have to be learning and evolving along the way. Planning into action, right? Making sure that everything is in place for implementation, such as resources, capacity, technical assistance, leadership, and readiness. And then again, power, right? Which I think is super important. Understanding all of the power that exists and making a commitment to name it, address it, and balance it, and learn and evolve from it every step of the way so that we can be making that paradigm shift in action. Next slide. So all of that basically brings us to why engagement to ownership, why this tool, right? It came from communities' experience of how they were literally not really being engaged well in the planning process, right? And they were asserting that, look, we need direct participation from impacted communities, right? That's the only way in which we're going to be closing kind of these equity gaps and also bringing attention to the climate vulnerabilities, as well as increasing our capacity to cultivate community solutions. And really understanding that in the planning context, the experience of engagement has been very one-sided, and that, again, to Christy's point, what we really need to be getting at here is like a reciprocity, a relationship. When we say engagement, what we actually should be meaning is collaboration. Next slide. And so that brings us to kind of like engagement to ownership toward collaborative governance, right? With community at the helm. And can, again, to increase kind of some of those capacities here. And with that, I just wanted to do a little bit of that framing because now we are going to dig into the spectrum. Michelle?
Okay, how many of you have seen this? Let me see, just hands or chats. How many of you have seen this or are using this? Okay, a handful of you. So, okay, good. What's interesting is actually I was using this spectrum before I even joined MSc, and I just didn't have as robust a version because it originally came from this International Association for Engagement, for Public Engagement. But it wasn't as robust, it definitely was not as pretty, and it didn't have this full spectrum. So this spectrum says, kind of what we were talking about before with people using the term equity or resilience or equality or justice and meaning completely different things. For a lot of communities, our experience is that governments, philanthropies, policymakers, even community organizations will say they're engaging the community, that they're involved in engagement, but they're meaning all of the different things on this spectrum. So they might mean that they actually ignored us. Hopefully they're not saying they're engaged in the work if they're doing that, but we know that that happens, especially when we're talking about planning and some of the climate work. So that's sort of an impact of marginalization in our community. And it sends a message in one way or another to the community saying that our voice, our needs, our ideas, our brilliance, our histories don't really matter. Then you have folks that are doing engagement work by informing us. So they say they're doing engagement, but really they just said, here is the decision we have made, right? So that would be that level 1. It might even be placation. Like, don't say we didn't do anything. We told you what our decision was. Let me know if any of this rings true for any of the experiences you all have. Consulting, okay, now we're starting to get to a little bit of back and forth, but it may also be tokenization. And it's sort of them saying, you know, they sort of know the decisions that they're going to make. They know the scope of the questions that they're asking, but they're saying, we care what you think. So maybe they held a survey, or maybe they had an information session and allowed the community to ask questions. So we're saying that's not really thorough engagement. The next phase, you're involving the community. There's a little bit more of a voice in there, and the power holders are basically saying, your input on this is actually changing some of our behavior and changing some of the ways that we think about this, and maybe even changing some of the questions. Hopefully we can all start getting our orgs and definitely our public offices towards these last stages of collaborating and even deferring to. So yeah, not only is your experience changing the way that we're behaving, but actually we're seeing you all need to lead, or we see that without your expertise and full engagement in this project or in these processes or in these plans, we actually won't succeed. And if you really believe in that, then eventually you start deferring to the community, and the community voice comes first. The community has ownership. They may be going to policyholders and experts for technical advice on different aspects, but the community is getting to say, these are the things that we actually need, or these are the ways that we actually want to address this. These are the ways we want to approach the issues in our own community. Let's do the next slide, which will just give us an overview. You all have this in the resource. Oh, I can't see all the chats, but I see someone's going to run for office. Do it. So this is more thorough. It's in your resource library. And I actually do invite you to take some time with this. I feel like almost everybody in this group has a place where you can use this tool and can, you know, take this. This is part of what I was doing again before I had this pretty and more thorough version, is going to my city and saying, hey, we think you all are here. And like, can you take this spectrum, and are you willing to just think through how you're behaving? What I loved about this version, especially once I got my hands on it, was this bottom line that says, that gives even some guidance about how some of the actions of policymakers and folks in power might look different. That says, here are the activities you might be doing if you're engaging in these different scales of the spectrum. And here's how resources might be allocated. And the fact that really once you move to, you know, levels 3, 4, 5, you're actually providing resources for the communities to do this type of work. Hallelujah. So with that, I think that we're doing well on time to get you all into breakout groups and really dive into this a little bit more, and try to just be honest about where your own organization is, for example. And this is something that we have found, I think, with MSC and the work that I was doing before. We would ask people where they think their org was, and then we'd see that not everybody in the org is on the same page. So hopefully this helps you understand and maybe be honest. And the other thing about this spectrum is, I think if you just ask people, where are you? For the most part, most people will think they're further to the right than where they actually are when they pause and consider their actions. This is not supposed to be like a report card. It's not like we are here and we've arrived. This isn't like we are bad because we're at this phase. This is like a model of development almost, like you might have in human development that says, you know, you're at this phase. That's fine. Here's what it will take to go to the next phase. So this isn't just supposed to be about like pointing fingers or, like I said, a report card. It's really supposed to be a process and a map to say, here's what it will look like to deepen into engagement work. And really, I can't think of very many offices, philanthropies, institutions, community-based organizations that don't say they want to be engaged with the communities they're working with.